Congress. Today we are going to talk about the extensive staff and the rather small bureaucracy that support the work of Congress. Again, the Capitol building, as I mentioned in the first set of notes, so what's really striking about the Capitol building is that this is a place of work. And you'll recall when we looked at the aerial view of the Capitol complex that there were numerous office buildings. So any visit to the Capitol building or their office building should really remind you of this, that Congress is very busy and it is a place of work. And a lot of that work, of course, is done by members of Congress themselves, who would be engaged in committee hearings or committee deliberations or the work on the congressional floor or in legislation. And a lot of the foundational work enabling members of Congress to effectively complete their work is done by an extensive staff. There is no way that any individual member of Congress, no matter how highly motivated, how ambitious, how intelligent, and how highly educated, could possibly keep up with or complete all the demands that are put upon him or her individually. And I would extend, of course, to our members of Congress the benefit of the doubt that they genuinely want to do a good job and that they all work hard. And so in order to be able to complete that, every member of Congress needs a staff. And every member of Congress, all 535 members, including has a government-funded staff. And this would be a staff of people who help them in their office in Washington, D.C., as well as a staff of people who keep an office open in their district and their state. So Jimmy Duncan has an office in Knoxville. He and other elected members of the House of Representatives have an office for their district. The senators tend to be allowed an office in major urban areas or population centers in their state. If I'm not mistaken, Senators Alexander and Corker each have offices in Knoxville, Chattanooga, Nashville, Jackson, and Memphis. And so they're pretty well staffed across the state. And so you can imagine that senators in even bigger states would be given pretty generous office staff so that they can have a presence close to their constituents. These people, this staff, is going to be a hierarchy, and you're going to have everybody on it from people who work in Washington, D.C. very closely with the members of Congress. And this would be the smaller part of the staff, a very highly professional, probably pretty well paid professional staff that would include a chief of staff, a communications director, a legislative director, etc. And underneath them, an army of interns, interns and residents and other professional staffers, perhaps paid or unpaid, who do important work for the member of Congress, whether it be research or communicating with constituents, filing correspondence, being involved in casework. A lot of the office staff at the district and state level will be directly involved in casework, whatever it is that they do. I'd say more of the day-to-day nuts and bolts kind of thing. But everybody is important. And for a great deal of the quantity, okay, the number of people who serve on the staffs of members of Congress, a lot of them are young, they're really intelligent, they're highly motivated people, and they work for little to no pay. Now, we're talking about people on the lower rungs of the lower rungs of the staff ladder. Of course, members of Congress will have just paid staffers that they keep. A lot of them keep interns. Some of them might be paid. A lot of them are not, but it's a great honor to hold these positions. And within these positions, there's a lot of turnover. I know I have several former students who have done internships over the summer, 2 for Senator Corker. I have one former student who was invited to do a semester-long internship for Jimmy Duncan. He was really, really interested in it. This would have been up in Washington, D.C. He was really interested in it, but it was unpaid, and he decided he couldn't make the financial commitment to that. He would have had to provide all of his own living expenses, and he was putting himself through college at the time. But anyway, I hope many of you all will look into that. Everybody I know who's done it has had a really, and I know people my age who did it when we were young, it's a really good experience. Get to be with, make great connections, do some great networking, get some good experience on your resume. So even if they don't pay you a lot, there's a lot in it on the experience side, and there's a great need. In addition to the individual members of Congress each having a staff in Washington, D.C. in their district and their state, each congressional committee, standing, joint, special, etc., also has a staff, and they're going to have on their staff lots of experts in their jurisdiction area, and lots of probably some lawyers and other people familiar with the legislative process. There's actually a lot of former lobbyists that work on congressional committees, etc. And so those are professional staffs that support the works of the committees, of the congressional committees. So we're talking about thousands of people here. It takes a lot more than the 535 elected members of Congress. Excuse me. Together, of course, with some of the unelected members of Congress who don't have voting rights, like from Puerto Rico and Guam, etc., Washington, D.C., to carry out the work. They need kind of what I think of as a small army of staff to carry out the work that they need to do. In addition to staffers, there are what are called bureaucratic agencies. We'll talk formally about the federal bureaucracy a little bit later, because most of it is an extension of the executive branch, and we usually think of bureaucracies as being agencies that administer the laws of government, that administer the policies of government. And that, in general, is an excellent definition of bureaucracy, and an effective state certainly needs a strong bureaucracy to work. Congress, the legislative branch, has its own bureaucracy, which is much smaller than the executive bureaucracy. It is comprised primarily of 3 really significant agencies. These agencies each have a very specific, fundamental, and really important job. And each of these agencies, I think it's super important to note, is incredibly nonpartisan and is staffed by different kinds of professionals. So the agencies of the bureaucratic agencies of the legislative branch are really notable for being nonpartisan, not being political agencies as much as the bureaucratic agencies, some of them in the executive branch, can be. The first agency I want to talk about is called the Congressional Research Service, and this is a rather small agency, and as you might guess, they do research. Legislators come across numerous issues. They take up thousands of bills every year. They're dealing with all kinds of stuff, and they can't possibly be educated in everything that they have to deal with, that they have to make laws about. And even if they are pretty well educated in a particular area, they might have a lot of questions about the specifics. And these questions go to the Congressional Research Service, which is staffed primarily by professional people, including researchers, archivists, scholars, other kinds of people, but people who are really, really highly skilled at finding information. I don't know that I would be qualified for this job, but I would love this job. They take in these requests, and they could be anything. They could be anything. How many bridges collapsed or became inoperable in the United States in the last 10 years? What was the economic impact in Seattle of raising the minimum wage from $10 to $12 to $15? How much more spending was there? How many jobs were lost? what was the overall impact? How many acres were burned in forest fires? What are the characteristics of the most successful school district? What is the most successful school district in the country? How many jobs are going to be created in plumbing or were created in plumbing in the last 10 years? And so it might be anything, and it could be very broad and analytical or quite specific. A lot of them are really quite specific, and this information helps members of Congress formulate policy or defend policy or make a decision about policy. And so these scholars and researchers and archivists find this information that the legislators need, and they relay it to them. And this is a pretty small agency, but they fill an average of about 250,000 requests a year. So they're busy, and I think just that sheer number tells us how necessary they are. So definitely, though, spending my days answering questions like that, looking up things, reading about things, I would love it. So put that on a list of Miss Chady's dream jobs. The next agency that we're going to talk about is called the GAO, or the Government Accountability Office. Now, I know, government accountability, congressional accountability, ha ha ha, isn't that funny? We all need to think that sometimes. This is something that might make people laugh. But indeed, there is an entire bureaucratic agency devoted to holding Congress accountable, whether it means that they are following the rules and the laws as prescribed for them, and that they are straight with all kinds of things. Very importantly, the GAO deals with the public. They handle all lawsuits and settlements to which Congress is a party, which is an amazing number of lawsuits and settlements, in addition to providing oversight and making sure that Congress in general is and their individual members are in compliance with the law. And if individual members of Congress were to have a question about a particular action being in compliance with the law, the GAO would be helpful to them in that. And so, as you might have guessed by now, the GAO is staffed by a lot of professional lawyers. This is a very lawyerly bureaucracy. Also, perhaps some accountants and others like that, but a lot of lawyers in the Government Accountability Office. And very, very importantly, this is an agency that, like I said, handles settlements and lawsuits brought against Congress as a whole or individual members of Congress. Perhaps the most well-known, and I think there's an argument for the idea that it's the most significant congressional bureaucratic agency, is what's called the CBO, or the Congressional Budget Office. The CBO was founded in the 1970s under a big budget act that we'll actually talk about in Unit 5. And it was created as Congress tried to streamline and overhaul the budgeting process in the American government, which since the 1920s has heavily involved the executive branch. And in the executive branch, there is an agency called the Office of Management and Budget. And so if you think about the Office of Management and Budget as being like the fiscal or the spending agency through which the president creates his budget, represents the president's priorities and interests, the CBO is originally designed as a counterweight to that, because Congress found in their part of dealing with taxes and spending in the budgeting process that they essentially were having to get all of their information from the executive branch. And so this law in the 1970s, this big budget overhaul, formed the CBO specifically to be a counterweight to the President's Office of Management and Budget. And the CBO is staffed by professional economists and accountants. And again, very important, these agencies are nonpartisan. And what the CBO does is, what their function is they make projections related to the budget, including deficit projections. I'll talk about that in just a minute. They make predictions on the economy, how the economy will fare. Will it grow slowly, quickly? Are we at risk of a recession? What kinds of jobs in the economy will be fastest growing, etc. So they do all kinds of economic projections and budget projections like that. And they also evaluate bills that have been introduced in Congress, particularly bills that are going to come to the floor for a vote. I don't know that they take up every single bill that's introduced, but if the bill's going to go to the floor for a vote, if it makes it that far, which most bills do not, as we'll see when we get into the legislative process, the CBO will issue a report on it. And the purpose of these reports is to make a realistic, to establish realistic expectations about the true cost of the bill. The cost of the bill in terms of dollars, the cost of the bill in terms of jobs, the cost of the bill in terms of economic growth. They vary. Recently, members of Congress have gone to the CBO to look at how repealing or reforming the Affordable Care Act would impact the number of people that have or carry health insurance. So not only just the dollar signs, but they might look at the total impact of a bill like that. And most of the time, people give pretty strong credibility to the information that comes out of the Congressional Budget Office because it is not partisan. The President's Office of Management and Budget is very partisan. Bills introduced in Congress tend to be very partisan. And as we've talked about before, and we'll talk about a lot more in this unit, and especially in the next unit, when members of Congress are advocating or pushing a bill, or they're fighting against a bill, or same for the White House, they tend to focus on what I would say, if they're in support of the bill, the best case scenario, the best possible outcome of this bill. The new tax bill is going to give people tons of money, and these corporations that are saving tons of money, they're going to hire lots of workers with it, best case scenario. Or if you're against the bill, the worst case scenario. Oh my goodness, people are going to have to pay more taxes. All that extra money will go into, dividends or whatever. So I think there's, not surprisingly, a tendency amongst our elected officials to focus on the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. And this makes the Congressional Budget Office really, really significant, and what they have to say really, really significant, because a lot of times, I'm sure it'd be no surprise to you, they will come back with the truth lying somewhere in between. Okay, it's not going to be the best case scenario or the worst case scenario. Like with the healthcare reform, the reality of those bills which didn't pass, the reality of those bills, according to the CBO, what was the impact going to be? There were going to be a lot of people who lost their health insurance. Negative impact. There was going to be substantial savings in government spending. You're going to have both of those things. And so I think the Congressional Budget Office is a great resource for that kind of information, for helping members of Congress and the public to determine what to think about policy, to make informed decisions. Now, this is kind of an old graphic, but let me show this to you just to kind of show you. These are projected deficits. All right, and we'll get into in the next unit exactly what a deficit is, but I think it will be no surprise to any of you to learn that we have a bit of a spending problem relative to our revenue in the United States government. Okay, so here we come through the 2000s. These were actual deficits. This is where the government was short revenue versus their spending. This is in billions of dollars with a B. I don't even know what 1600 billion, I mean, what is that? I don't even know how many zeros there is in that. And so just to kind of show you the nonpartisan estimate versus the partisan estimate, the CBO, you can see consistently always has a little bit more realistic projection of what the deficit would be, because it's not going for either the best case scenario or the worst case scenario. The White House And the OMB, since the president presents the budget, is always going to be going for the best case scenario when it comes to the deficit. So I think it's just a good way of doing. Oh, look at that, $1 trillion. So I don't know how many zeros are in $1 trillion. I'm going to go look that up. All right, so good information from the CBO. I think it's always useful to try to look for and keep in mind what they have to say about the actual cost of a bill or program.